So this is the second video on blood glucose and obesity. The first one referred to regulation of blood glucose, and this one will now refer to diabetes and the different types. So if you're diabetic, it basically means that you cannot regulate your own blood glucose. Now there are a few reasons why that is, but your definition simply is that it cannot regulate blood glucose. Now the problem with that is then, and you'll have seen that in the previous video, that if blood glucose is uncontrolled and remains high, it can lead to any kind of vascular diseases. So things like stroke, things like peripheral vascular disease, cardiovascular disease, things like that. Okay, and there are two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Now you'll need to be able to describe the features of these and then when they develop and things like that. So type 1 typically develops in childhood. Now that's not exclusively, but it's commonly. Type 2, however, will develop in adulthood. And type 2 is often related to being overweight or even obese. Okay, or obese individuals. A person with type 1 diabetes, because of an autoimmune disease, cannot produce insulin. So their pancreas does not produce insulin, and therefore because of that, they can't store that glucose as glycogen. So to treat that then, we then give people with type 1 diabetes regular injections of insulin. As well as being aware and controlling their diet so it's not too high in glucose. Okay, so type 1, childhood, and they can't produce insulin, and then regular insulin injections as a treatment. For type 2, it develops in adulthood. Now for the type 2 person, they can produce insulin. But the problem is that they are less sensitive to it. Okay, because they have developed what's called insulin resistance. Now that is developed because they have decreased the number of insulin receptors on their cells. Okay, so when you have less insulin receptors to take insulin into the cells, that then leads to glucose not being converted into glycogen. Or at least not as much. So therefore, because it's not stored as glycogen, it remains in the blood. So the treatment for this then is not the same as type 1, because these people can produce insulin, they're just not sensitive to it. So because it's related to being overweight or obese, we have regular exercise, which then can decrease their body weight, but also will burn off some of the glucose. Weight loss, which is related to that previous one. We would decrease glucose in the diet. And then you can also take medication. And that medication then would decrease glucose in the blood and therefore prevent that damage that would be caused by unregulated blood glucose. Okay, so the next bit we're going to talk about is the issues coming from that type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and then the glucose tolerance test. Okay, so in both types of diabetic, after a meal or an intake of any kind of sugar, blood glucose will rise, and it will rise rapidly. So your body has to get rid of this some way, And the kidneys will then end up removing some of this. Because the kidneys are involved in urine production, and then some of the glucose will end up in the urine. This is also why the kidneys are often damaged in people with untreated diabetes. So what we can do is we can also detect or basically kind of predict whether a person has diabetes by testing the urine and testing it for glucose. Now, to confirm that a person has diabetes, what we would then use is what's called the glucose tolerance test. So it's used to diagnose diabetes. So what this involves then is a person being not quite starved, but after fasting. So there's a period of fasting, and then their blood glucose is measured. Now, after they've fasted and after the blood glucose is measured, what they'll then do is give them a glucose drink. You have a known concentration. And then we'll measure it again, measure their blood glucose again over time. And that's what that graph below shows. So on the y-axis we've got blood glucose, and then on the x-axis we've got time in hours. So it doesn't really matter what times these are, okay, but generally this would be by fasting, and then a person would be given a drink. Okay, so just for talking's sake, we'll just say that the drink was given there. Now, when you have a look at these graphs, the diabetic person is always the person on top. Okay, and this would be the non-diabetic person who can control his blood glucose or her blood glucose. So as time goes on, a person's blood glucose will increase when they've had a drink of glucose. Now, in a non-diabetic person, insulin would then be produced, which would bring this down again. Then when it drops too low, glucagon is produced that then brings it back up. But for a person with diabetes, what happens is their blood glucose is not regulated in the same way because they can't either produce insulin or are not sensitive to it. So to be able to tell the difference between these two, a person with diabetes on a blood glucose tolerance test would begin higher. So their blood glucose would begin at a higher concentration. Okay, and you see this here, their resting blood glucose is much higher than a normal person. It peaks higher as well. So when you get that peak of blood glucose, it is higher, and it takes longer to return to their starting concentration. So to their resting blood glucose concentration. Now, the reason why this is going down would in a normal person be due to the effect of insulin. But in a person with diabetes, that drop is typically due to not the effect of insulin, but because that glucose has either been lost and it's been lost in the urine. Now also, that glucose can be used in respiration. So there would be a drop in blood glucose because of that use in respiration too. It's not being brought down by the storage of glucose into glycogen, because that would be what insulin would do. It's being lost due to glucose being processed and then dumped out of the kidneys. Okay, so for this, kidneys then remove some of that glucose, so you find it in the urine. And then we use a glucose tolerance test to diagnose that diabetes. So a diabetic person is always up here, it's always the person on top, because they begin higher, they peak higher, and they take longer to return to their starting. Yes, if I make that clear, so to return to. Okay, so I'm going to stop now and then do the next part, which will be the obesity video.